Subscribe to the Gian Nigo channel so you don't miss exciting videos.
Cuba is an archipelago in the Caribbean Sea, and its main island is Cuba, with an area of over 109,000 square kilometers, ranking 104th in the world.
This area is about 1/3 of our country. About half of Cubans are called mulatto, meaning people of mixed white and colored descent. About 1/3 are white, about 10% are colored, and there is a percentage of people of Chinese origin. There are also other ethnic groups. Cuba is a multi-ethnic country, home to people of different ethnic, religious, and national origins. Through generations of historical changes, they now live together under the Cuban flag, and Cuba's economy is currently very difficult.
According to official data, Cuba's economy declined by about 2% in 2023, while inflation increased to 30%. Fuel shortages and basic goods shortages frequently occur. The Cuban government supplies almost all goods and services for people's consumption.
Recently, Cuba increased gasoline prices, which is one of the measures to reduce the budget deficit.
The country's gasoline prices skyrocketed, increasing fivefold. A liter of regular gasoline rose from 25 Cuban pesos, equivalent to 25,700 Vietnamese dollars, to 132 Cuban pesos, i.e., at such a price per liter of gasoline, anywhere would be considered high, not to mention in a country with a difficult life like Cuba, it is extremely expensive. However, public transportation service prices remain unchanged, meaning those who use the public transportation system are essentially unaffected. Natural gas prices have not increased yet but are predicted to rise. Additionally, tourists in Cuba must pay in foreign currency for gasoline or oil purchases to help Cuba accumulate more foreign currency.
What has made Cuba so difficult? Because Cuba is still a subsidized society. Looking at Cuba, we see Vietnam in the past, where production facilities and economic management belong to the state. Workers also mainly work for state-owned companies, although private enterprises have begun to emerge recently with Cuba's gradual easing. The Cuban government imposes most prices and food rations for its citizens, meaning market prices do not exist.
Moreover, any company wanting to hire Cuban workers must pay the Cuban government, which then pays the individual directly in Cuban pesos, meaning the Cuban government receives foreign currency and pays in domestic currency. Cuba's economic decline has historical roots.
Starting in the late 1980s, Soviet aid to Cuba's economy gradually dried up.
Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was an extremely important source of aid for Cuba.
Essential.
The Soviet Union once paid high prices for Cuba's sugar products and provided oil to the country at below market prices.
The disappearance of those subsidies due to the Soviet collapse plunged Cuba's economy into a rapid recession, known as the Special Period in Cuba.
At its peak, there were years when Cuba received up to $6 billion United States dollars. Throughout the 1970s to 1980s, when did the Soviet Union accept providing aid in exchange for? They exchanged it for a strategic ally right next to the United States. Cuba is very far from it.
During this period,
Thanks to Soviet aid, other socialist countries, and domestic self-reliance, Cuba's economy grew rapidly. In the 1970s, when we were moving toward national reunification and in the early years of peace, Cuba's economy grew at an average of about 7% per year, and in the early 1980s, 8% per year.
This income was described as reaching the world.
But after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba lost its most important trading partner, and Cuban living standards spiraled downward.
The Cuban government has also made many efforts, trying to develop tourism, especially medical tourism, because Cuba's healthcare is highly regarded.
They consider it one of the important means of generating income for For many years, Cuba has developed special hospitals treating specific diseases for foreigners and diplomats. Each year, thousands of Europeans, Latin Americans, Canadians, and Americans come here to use medical services, with prices up to 80% lower than in.
That's also a story of previous years, because I believe images of pharmacies in Cuba, pharmacies that dawn.
What about sugar? At some points, Cuba was once the world's largest sugar producer and exporter. However, due to poor investment and natural disasters, Cuba's sugar production has also seriously. Over 20 years ago, in 2002, more than half of Cuba's sugar factories had to close, and sugar production was only a century away from that.
It's been enough to convince leaders that they must change the country.
By the late 1990s, people believed Cuba could recover because the economic situation was somewhat. At that time, Cuba had more or less economic relations with most Latin American countries and also improved relations with the European Union. Cuba also found its allies a few years later, such as Venezuela or Bolivia.
But now looking at both countries that were once close friends of Cuba, close geographically and politically, those countries are just as difficult as Cuba. These countries were once major oil and natural gas exporters and helped Cuba obtain important subsidies.
When mentioning Cuba's economic difficulties, people always have a default saying, the US embargo on Cuba is why Cuba is so different. So why does the US embargo Cuba, and is this the only reason? The US is a giant geographically, a giant in population, a giant economically, a giant militarily. Cuba's proximity to the United States is important, and how Cuba chooses its diplomatic direction is. After the Cuban Revolution in 1959, relations between the two countries deteriorated significantly and remained tense and confrontational ever since. The United States has no formal diplomatic relations with Cuba and maintains an embargo, making commercial transactions by U.S. companies.
The U.S. imposed the embargo because Cuba nationalized American company assets during the revolution.
Immediately after the U.S. embargo was imposed, Cuba's economy fell into difficulty, as about 95% of Cuba's needs of production and most components were imported from the U.S., before Cuba gradually shifted towards the Soviet Union.
That's main export market, causing the country. In 2015, the Obama administration announced it would remove Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism.
However, U.S. foreign policy has changed across presidential administrations, and Cuba still faces many difficulties. Vietnam-Cuba relations have always been a very special bond, exactly as the late Chairman Fidel Castro once said. For Vietnam, Cuba is willing to shed its own blood.
There are many stories about Cuba's assistance. For example, Cuba dedicated an entire radio channel,
broadcasting 6 times a week in English so that people in North America and the Caribbean could understand the true nature of the U.S.-led war of aggression against Vietnam.
During the war years, Cuba provided Vietnam with essential supplies such as medicine, sugar, synthetic fiber, and ropes for anchoring boats.
These were all very precious items at the time. Without this aid, Vietnam would certainly have faced greater hardships. Not only material help, Cuba also sent hundreds of doctors, engineers, workers, and much modern machinery to assist Vietnam in building infrastructure like hospitals, schools, factories, roads, and farms.
There were even times when Cuba's aid exceeded its own capacity.
Vietnam never forgets its friends' kindness. When Vietnam faced difficulties, we were ready to share. When we faced difficulties, Vietnam also hoped. In terms of trade, Vietnam is currently Cuba's second largest Asian trading partner after China. Key Vietnamese exports to Cuba include rice, electronics, clothing, footwear, cosmetics, construction materials, industrial materials. These products are always highly appreciated by the Cuban people for their quality and variety of design. There have also been other important milestones. For example, in 2018, Vietnam canceled Cuba's debt. The press often reports on Vietnam's debts of thousands of tons of rice to Cuba. In early 2023, Vietnam gave Cuba 5,000 tons of rice at 300 calories.
Rather than.
It should be understood that Cuba currently has to import about 70 to 80% of its food, so gifts from Vietnam are extremely valuable. A little in time of need is worth more than a lot in time of plenty. Finally, as Cuba's economy faces many difficulties, what will become of its military? Looking back in history, under Chairman Fidel Castro, Cuba became a highly militarized society. From 1975 to the late 1980s, abundant military aid from the Soviet Union allowed Cuba to enhance its military capability right next to the United States. After losing aid from the Soviet Union, Cuba was forced to significantly reduce its troop numbers. From a peak of 235,000 personnel, the Cuban military decreased to about 50,000 by 2019. The government currently spends about 1.7% of GDP on defense. Currently, the Cuban military also has an influence on the economy. The military manages many enterprises in key economic sectors, contributing about 4% of Cuba's GDP.
Limited budget makes it difficult for Cuba to purchase modern weapon systems. They are forced to strive to upgrade old weapons and create many unique homemade weapon types. These are the hardships and struggles of the heroic Cuban people. There, we seem to see the image of Vietnam in the past with its subsidized economy and lack of many shortages.
How Cuba handles its relationship with the United States has this.
Thank you for taking the time to follow the story about Cuba.
If you found it interesting, you can subscribe to the Hidden Ledger channel and continue for company highlights,
as well as our other channels. We bid farewell and thank you very much.